The last step in building my model is to write the code for loading and parsing the JSON. Sports Events JSON is a file contained in the bundle of my application. My code is going to load the contents from the file that are in the bundle and then pass those contents to a parser that will create instances of sports event and put them in an array. So my next step is to create the parser and then create the loader that calls the parser. So I'm going to select the model folder, hold the control key down and click and say that I want a new file. It's going to be an iOS Swift file. It's going to be located in my model and I'm going to call it Sports Events JSON Parser .swift. So this is going to be a class that is going to contain a method that is going to be a class method, so that I don't need to create an instance of this class. I don't need to create an object to call the method. So first I'm going to create the class, and the class is going to be the same name as the file, Sports Events JSON Parser. The class is going to have a function that I'm going to call to parse the JSON. So I'm going to actually call this function parse. So I'm going to say func parse, and the parse method is going to receive some data. So I'm going to write this. And what this means is that this parameter is not going to be named when it's called. So we're going to call parse and we're going to pass it some data. And internally in the function, we're going to refer to the data using the name data. So we're going to receive some data of type data. It's going to be accessible via the name data, but when parse is called, we're not going to name the parameter, we're just going to pass the data. The result of parse is going to return an array of sports event type. That was the struct we create, sports event, so we're going to have an array of sports event being returned. Now, as I mentioned, this function, I want to be able to call it without creating an instance of sports events JSON parser. I want to be able to, what we would call in other languages, create a static function of this class. In Swift, I can put before the func name class, and that will indicate that this function can be called on the class, not on an instance of the class. So inside this function, my goal is to take the data that I've received, parse it, and create an array of sports event. Before I begin the parsing process, I'm going to create an array of sports event to hold these sports events as I parse them, and then this is the array that I'm going to return at the bottom of the function. So I'm going to say var sports events is going to be an array of sports event, and to construct an instance I put parentheses after it. So this is the type array of sports event, and this says let's create an array of sports event. So now we have the array, and we're going to have some code in between this that is going to do the parsing, but at the bottom of this function we're going to return sports events. So in between my creating an empty array and returning it, I have to do the parsing. There is an ability in the library provided in Swift for parsing JSON using JSON serialization. So I'm going to start by writing a line of code, and then I'm going to explain it. So I'm going to say if let JSON equal try question mark JSON serialization dot JSON object, and I want to pass it data and options. So the data that I'm going to pass it is the data I received in the parse function, so that's going to be called data. And the options, I'm not going to have any, so I'm going to pass it an empty set of options. Now, this is an if-let because JSON serialization, JSON object can fail. This can fail because it encounters some data it doesn't understand or can't parse. And the way it fails is by throwing an exception. And like other languages, Swift has the ability to do essentially a try-catch. But we, instead of using a try-catch, can turn the try into an optional. If it fails, we're going to get nil. If it succeeds, we're going to get the result. So that's try question mark. It says, let's do this thing that can throw an exception. If we succeed, great. Then we're going to have a result that we can unwrap. If we fail, we're going to get a nil, and we can't unwrap it, and the if-let will fail. So what this is going to do is take the data being the contents of the JSON file that we're going to load in a separate step, parse it, and this thing here that is set in JSON is going to be the top-level node in JSON. So if I look at the JSON file, the top-level entity is an object that contains a status of that's a key and events that is a key. So there are two keys. Those are the only keys that are part of this top-level object. So I need to work with that top-level object, and what I need to do with that object is retrieve the object that this represents. And objects in Swift that are contained in JSON, so an object in JSON when parsed in Swift will become a dictionary, because dictionaries hold key value pairs, and a JSON object is made up of key value pairs. So the JSON node, this thing that's being returned here, needs to be cast as a dictionary of the type that it is. And this casting is going to use ask question mark, so it can fail. So I'm going to put this in the if-let so that we will only proceed if it succeeds. So we're going to have another let that says let root equal JSON as question mark, and then a type of dictionary that is a string any. So this JSON, again, which is going to be our top-level node of the kind of JSON tree, is going to be cast as a dictionary of string any. That is, the keys are going to be strings, and the value could be any type. And when we go to get the particular value, we're going to have to cast it for the type that it is. But right now, the dictionary for the object that is the top-level node is going to have keys that are strings, and that's always going to be the case in JSON, and values that are going to be any. And if we're able to take this top-level node and cast it as a string any, then the if-let will unwrap it, and it'll be assigned here to a thing that I'm calling root. Now, the root dictionary, looking again at the JSON, is going to have first a key value pair that is a key of status and a value of OK. Now this doesn't make a lot of sense in a file that is included in the project, but I'm writing this parser to deal with the JSON the way it would come from a server. And it's possible when I make a request from a server for some JSON data, for any data, that it could fail to retrieve the data and send it back to me. Maybe it can't access the database, or some sort of network connection is down, or some service is broken. So instead of returning a status of OK, it might return a status of error. I need to know that the status is OK before I parse the rest of the document. So that's what I'm going to do next in my parser. And what I'm going to do is check to see that I can retrieve the status from the root node, cast it as a string, and then I want to make sure that the status is actually OK. So this is going to be a continuation of my if let. I'm going to say let status equal my root node, which is a dictionary, and I'm going to access a dictionary element by giving it the key. The key I'm interested in is status. And I'm going to need to be able to cast this value associated with the key of status, which right now is cast as an any. It needs to be castable as a string, because the status being OK means that the value associated with the key of status is the string OK. So I'm going to say as string. And then if we get a status, so if we're able to retrieve the status from the dictionary, successfully cast it as a string, therefore we're going to be able to unwrap it and it's going to be assigned a status, then I want to see that status is equal to OK. If we're able to do all of that, then we're ready to work down through the rest of the data. That is, get the sports events and parse those, and then create instances of them and put them in the array. And I'm going to do a little indentation here so this is easier to read. So now inside of here, inside this if let, we are at the point where we can retrieve the array of events from JSON. So I'm going to put if let events equal, and I'm using the root node again because events is a key off of the root node. And this value associated with the key of events is an array. And I'm going to therefore cast this as an array. And I'm not going to care what the type is in the array at the moment, so I'm going to say that it's an array of any. So inside this if let, if it succeeds, and what we're talking about here is key of events is going to point to an array of objects, and so we're going to say here that the key of event is going to, from this dictionary, return a value that I'm expecting to be an array. So if I can cast this as an array of any, then events will hold the unwrapped version of that, and I can work with it. So I have an array of events. Since I have an array, I need to iterate through the array. So I'm going to use a for loop. I'm going to say for event in events. So I'm going to get one event at a time. So we're talking about, we're inside this array, and we're going to get each of these one at a time. And we know that each of these events, because it's wrapped in curly braces here in the JSON, is an object. And objects are represented in Swift as dictionaries. And so I need to be able to take the event and cast it as a dictionary. So I'm going to say if let event equals event as question mark, and then the dictionary is going to be made up of string any. If we're able to do that, then we have an event, and that event is a dictionary containing keys that are strings and values that are any. If I go back to my JSON, I see here that my keys are strings and my values are strings. So I don't actually need to use the any here. I could say, because I know that all of my events are dictionaries of string, I could say here that these events that I'm pulling out should be castable as of type string. Key of string, value of string. So inside this if-let, if I can successfully take the event and cast it as a dictionary of string, I can then get the properties of the event, which are going to be the name of the sport, which has got a key of sport, the matchup, which is a key of matchup, and the date, which is a key of date. So I am going to pull those pieces, and each of those will be assigned to a constant. So I'm going to say if let sport name equal event sport. And sport name is going to be of type string because we said that the value resulting from this dictionary event is going to be a string. So event sport is going to give me a string, and that's what I want sport name to be. So the next thing I've got to pull out is the matchup. So I'm going to say let matchup equal event matchup. And then finally, I'm going to say let date string equal event date. So if I succeed at pulling all three pieces of information, then I can work with those pieces of information to create a sports event instance and then put it in the array of sports events. Now, my date needs to be converted to a date type. Right now it's a date string, and I need a date type because the initializer for sports event needs a date type. And to do that, I'm going to use a date formatter. And it is not wise to create date formatters over and over again. I'd like to create one date formatter and reuse it. So in my class, I want to create a property that is an instance of a date formatter. And I don't want to have this property be part of an instance of this class. I want to be able to access it on the class directly. So I put the word static in front of its definition, and that means it belongs to the class rather than to an instance of the class. So I can say static let date formatter equal date formatter. So I'm creating an instance of a date formatter and assigning it to the property date formatter, and it's static, so it is a member of the class, not an instance of the class. I can call it here in my class function without having an instance of sports events JSON parser. So now I'm going to use that date formatter to convert the date strings to Swift date instances. In order to do that, I need to know the format of my date, and that's going to be used to convert the date string into a date instance. So I need to set the date format on the date formatter. So I'm going to do that inside of my parse function, outside of the loops, because I only need to do this once. And I'm going to say date formatter dot date format equals some string that indicates the format of the date. And the format of dates that are presented here in the JSON are year, month, day, hour, and minute. So we can represent that format by saying 4 capital Y's for year, 2 capital M's for month, 2 lowercase d's for day, 2 uppercase h's for hours, 2 lowercase m's for minute. And you can Google on the internet and find the kind of date format strings that the date formatter accepts. But this will work with the date format that we have in the JSON. So I want to be able to take the date string and convert it to a date. And when I do that, it might fail because not all strings are valid dates. So I'm going to put this in my if let. So I'm going to have here let date equal date formatter dot date from string. And the string is going to be the date string that we got in the previous part of the if let. So if we're able to take the date, get it as a date string and unwrap it, then we're going to use that date string with the date formatter to construct a date. And again, not all strings are valid dates, so this could fail, which is why it's in an if let. If it succeeds, then we can proceed to use it. I'm going to make my editing area a little bigger here, and I'm going to put this curly brace here at the end. So inside of this if let, we now have all of the pieces of information we need to construct a sporting event. And we're going to use the failable initializer on sports event. That's this one, because we're going to pass in the sport name. Since it is something that can fail, it's going to result in an optional. And if we want to test if it succeeded, then we're going to need to be able to unwrap it. So I'm going to use an if let. So I'm going to say if let sports event equal sports event parentheses, and I'm going to use the failable initializer, the one that receives a sport name rather than a sport. So the sport name is going to come from sport name. The matchup is going to come from matchup, and the date is going to come from the date. If we succeed in producing a sports event, then we're going to want to append it to the sports events array. So we're going to say sports events dot append, and the element that we're going to append is the sports event. So this for event and events is going to loop through this array of events, and it's going to get each one of these sports events, and it's going to create an instance and stick it in the array. So when we're done, we're going to return the array of sports events, and that is the data that we're going to work with in our application to display a list of these sports events. So the final step is to write the loader that is going to load the contents of the JSON file in the bundle and call this parser. So I'm going to control-click on the model folder, select New File. I'm going to create an iOS Swift file. And in the model, I am going to create a loader for loading the JSON. So I'm going to create a class again. And this class is going to be called Sports Events JSON Loader. So Sports Events JSON Loader. And the loader's job is to load the file from the bundle and then pass the data to the parser, get the events, and return them. So the class that I'm going to create is going to be called Sports Events JSON Loader. And I want to be able to call the load function of this class without creating an instance of the class. So I'm going to make it a class function. I'm going to say class func load. And load is going to receive the name of the JSON file to load. So we're going to say we're receiving a file name of type string. And the loader is going to load that file, and then it is going to call the parser to turn it into an array of sports events. So the return is going to be of type sports event array. So now it's possible when we parse the JSON that it's going to fail to parse it. But we always need to return an array of sports event. So I'm going to begin by creating an empty array of sports event. So I'm going to call this events, and it's an array of sports event. So I have an empty array, and now I'm going to attempt to load the file and parse it. So the path to the file is obtained using bundle.main.path. And remember that this JSON file is in the bundle, and so I have to use bundle to access it. So I'm going to say let path equal bundle.main.path, and I'm going to give it a resource name of type. So the resource name is going to be the file name, and in this case the file name should not have an extension on it. The extension is going to come from of type, and that is going to be JSON. So the extension of this file is JSON, so file name here, the file name that we're passing into load, needs to just be sports_events. So bundle main path, given that file name with that extension, is going to return a path or not based on whether that path actually exists, which means this could fail. If we hold option and click on this, we'll see that this results in a string optional. We only want to proceed if the return string isn't nil, so we can put this in an if let. So we're going to only execute the code in the if let if the path exists. So now if we have a path, the next thing that we need to try to do is to load the data at that path. And we're going to use the data type to load from that path. And the data type can throw an exception if it's unable to create an instance of data. That is, it has a failable initializer in the sense that it can throw an exception. So I'm going to use try ? to turn the exception into an optional. And so this is going to be part of my if let, because it's something that could fail. And so like I have done in the past, I'm going to say let data equal try ? So if what I'm about to do succeeds, then I'm going to get a value that can be unwrapped, and it's going to be put in data. And if it fails, it's going to return nil, and it can't be unwrapped, and this if let will fail. What am I going to try to do? I'm going to try and construct a data type, and I'm going to get the data from a file. So I'm looking for contents of URL, and the URL is not the path as a string, but as a URL type. So I'm going to need to take this path and turn it into a URL. So here where it says URL, I'm going to put URL parentheses, and the URL is going to be a URL that's constructed from a file URL with a path that is a string. And the string is going to be the path. So let's relook at this line again. We're going to try to construct a data type based on the contents of a URL where the URL is constructed from the path that was created here. We need a comma at the end to separate our if-let pieces. And I'm going to put this curly brace right up beside here. So if I succeed at being able to get the data, then I'm going to want to pass the data to the parser and have the parser return the events. So I'm going to here say events equal, and my parser was sports events JSON parser, and it is going to receive nothing because I'm not going to construct an instance. Remember that sports events JSON parser is a class where parse is a class function, which means I don't need to create an instance of sports events JSON parser. I can call it directly on the class. So I'm going to say sports events JSON parser dot parse, and then I'm going to pass it the data. If we fail in either of these if-let statements, then we will never get here, and what I will have is an empty array of sports events. If I'm able to get the path and then use the path to get the data and then pass the data and parse it, then events will be replaced. This empty array of sports events will be replaced with what the parse function in sports events JSON parser returns. And sports events JSON parser returns an array of sports event, not an optional array, an array. So if it fails to parse, it's going to return an empty array. And if it succeeds, it's going to return an array of items in it. So if we get to this line, events will either have the parser giving us an empty array or giving us an array with the items in it. So again, if we're able to succeed with this if-let, then we're going to replace the empty array with whatever the parser returns. So after this, we're going to return events, and our sports events JSON loader is something we're going to be able to call using the class method load, and it will result in us having an array of events to work with. So with this, we now have the complete model for the application, and we can begin building the functionality of the app based on this model.